Sounds good. Live. Okay, we're live. Welcome to the September 18th, 2024 meeting of the University of Rhode Island Board of Trustees Governance Committee. The meeting is being held in person with some committee members participating remotely. At this time, I will conduct a roll call attendance to determine if a quorum is present. Please clearly respond present via WebEx or present in person when your name is called. I am here, Courtney Nicolato, Vice Chair Jay Placencia.
Present via WebEx.
Charles Fogarty. Monica Garnes.
Present via WebEx.
Matthew Lenz.
Present via.
Joseph Matthews.
Present via WebEx.
Robert Wagan.
Present via WebEx.
David Caprio. And President Mark Perlange.
Present via WebEx.
A quorum is present, and also thrilled to share that Board Chair Margot Cook and Vice Chair Armand Sabatoni are also present. For the benefit of all, Board Secretary Michelle Karuri will also recognize members of senior leadership who are participating remotely.
Yes, we have Lauren Jensen, we have Barb Wolf, I'm not doing this in any particular order, just looking at the squares, Abby Benson, and Chelsea Berry, as well as Markeisha Minor.
Great, thank you so much.
For our last
reminder. Perfect, thank you, Michelle. A reminder to all members for the benefit of our audience and for the note taker, please clearly identify yourself whenever you comment, make a motion or a second to a motion. Participants using WebEx are required to keep their cameras on, as remote members and all persons present at the meeting location must clearly be audible and visible to one another. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. Do we have any amendments to the published agenda? Hearing none, I will move on. The first order of business is the approval of the minutes from June 28th, 2024. May I have a motion that the committee approve the minutes of the June 28th, 2024 meeting?
So moved, Jay Placencia.
Thanks, Jay. May I have a second?
Second, Joseph Matthews.
Thank you, Joe. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I will ask for a voice vote. All in favor, please say yes. Yes?
Yes.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion to approve the minutes of the June 28th, 2024 meeting is approved. The next item on the agenda is item number 2, discussion items. We do have two areas that we will defer as part of this meeting, just so that the group is aware. 2F, which is the regulation and control of URI property. And 3A, which is the review of the amendments to the URI Board of Trustees bylaws and recommendations to the URI Board of Trustees. These will be handled in future meetings. So we will start with 2A, which is the update on Title IX and the implementation of the URI Board of Trustees non-discrimination and sexual misconduct policy, and I will turn it over to Kara.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. As you might recall, the board just this past June approved a new policy on non-discrimination and sexual misconduct, and that was in anticipation of implementing the new Title IX regulations, which had an effective date of August 1st of this year. Over the course of the summer, various states engaged with litigation against the Department of Education. And as a result of those lawsuits, a number of injunctions prohibiting the Department of Education from implementing the new rules have been put into place. In addition to the states that sued, several private organizations, Young America's Foundation, Female Athletes United, and Moms for Liberty joined in one of the lawsuits, Tennessee versus Cardona. Kansas versus Cardona. So that the end result of that is when that court issued an injunction, it included individual schools that have members or children of members of those three organizations. And on a list of nearly 700 institutes of higher education, URI and Rhode Island College are on that list, which effectively brings us into the ambit of those injunctions, even though the remainder of Rhode Island is in fact implementing the new Title IX regulations. A question was raised as to, how the state of Rhode Island has been reacting to this. And in fact, Rhode Island was one of 16 states represented by their attorneys general who filed an amicus brief in the Tennessee versus Cardona case back in May in support of the Biden administration's position. It didn't it didn't help the cause, unfortunately, because the court did in fact issue that injunction anyway. So right now we have injunctions in effect in 26 states. And hundreds of schools nationwide, K through 12, as well as higher education. And while the Department of Education petitioned for relief from the United States Supreme Court and asked that the injunctions be at least partially stayed so that the majority of the rules could still be implemented, the United States Supreme Court on August 16th denied that motion. So the status of the litigation is that it is now just moving through the ordinary course of appellate litigation, which can take months, if not more. So consequently, URI is in the position of continuing to process all of our Title IX cases using the policy on sexual misconduct that the board approved in 2020 to implement the prior set of regulations, the 2020 regulations, which we are forced to operate under. Nevertheless, I also want to assure everyone that we have a robust Title IX program that exists regardless of what set of regulations apply. Previously, I was handling all the Title IX cases. We were very fortunate to be able to recently hire the university's first full-time Title IX coordinator, and her name is Emily Douglas, and she started on June 24th. So we now have someone who is devoting the entirety of her job to Title IX compliance, which will allow us to implement even better supports and programs for our students and employees. In addition to Emily, we have Keith LaBelle. He is the Deputy Title IX Coordinator for Education, Outreach, and Training. Now, Keith has been with the university for almost 20 years and working in the field of sexual violence prevention that entire time. But he was brought under the Title IX office about 3 years ago. And so he's been working under the auspices of Title IX, effectively doing the same work and running the URI bystander intervention program that we call iStand. And so he is also doing great work and has been doing it for almost 20 years. So the way we support both students and employees is twofold. We have obviously the need to respond to incidents that are reported to us. And we also just provide general support to students in terms of information and education, training, and in particular, support for pregnancy and related conditions, which has been covered under Title IX for decades, and has always been an obligation of universities. So the way we respond to incidents is we have a Title IX complaint resolution process that is under the policy and the procedures that we developed pursuant to that policy on sexual misconduct. And that, in keeping with the 2020 regulations, involves investigation and a hearing and a decision and an appeal process, just broad strokes. So that requires a formal complaint to be filed by an individual. If they do not want to file a formal complaint, we still offer supportive measures, meaning we can help them if they don't want to have contact. We can issue no contact directives. We can help them if there's if they share housing with someone that participated in an incident of sexual assault or violence with them. And We can adjust housing, we can adjust academics and classes and all sorts of things just to allow them to maintain their access, their complete equal access to the education program and activities, which is the point of the Title IX law. We also have a sexual assault response team, which is made up of the Title IX coordinator, the head of the Office of Community Standards, the dean of students, a member of our campus police, and our head of VPAS, Violence Prevention Advocacy Services. And that group meets during the school year, meets weekly, and discusses cases that have come in and the best way to handle them, respond, and support the parties involved. So among the resources that we have available to students, we have the VPAS, the Violence Prevention Advocacy Services. Kelly Ryan runs that. That is under Health Services. We also have the University Counseling Services that is available to students who are involved in any Title IX related matters. Health Services as well is available, particularly in immediate response to an incident where medical treatment might need to be provided immediately, or even transport to a local hospital for what is commonly called a rape kit. The Psychological Consultation Center is also available, and that is, and if employees are involved, that's a service that is available specifically to employees. Whereas like VPAS is not available to employees. That's a student-only resource. The Chaplains Association on campus is also a resource, the Women's Center, and of course, campus police if there is any need for, if anyone wants to pursue any sort of criminal complaint. With respect specifically to pregnancy and related conditions, we support both students and employees by having, we have currently 9 lactation spaces across Kingston, the Narragansett Bay campus, and up at the Rhinebeck, the Rhode Island Nursing Education Center. So all of those lactation spaces are available for nursing mothers. And we also, in order to accommodate pregnancy and related conditions, there's also a support system of providing academic adjustments by working with faculty to address needs in maybe some absences, changing test taking locations or dates, anything that might be needed to, again, allow equal access to all of the education programs and activities to which that student is entitled. So that is kind of the broad overview of how we continue to support our students, regardless of any political, stuff that's going on external to the university. We make sure that none of that actually has a concrete impact on our ability to comply with the law.
Great, thanks, Kara. Margot, I see you have your hand raised.
Thank you. So Kara, first of all, that's really comforting to hear because this really worries me. And this can be, as you said, caught up in the courts forever. And it's at the expense of potential care for our students in really acute situations. So what you're describing gives me a lot of comfort. What would be different? Let's play this out, that in a scenario where the regulations around Title IX have to continue the way they are, versus what we'd like to see and the rest of the state of Rhode Island gets to implement. What's the difference in how we approach a sexual assault case, or like what's the gap that would occur?
Okay. Well, with specifically to in the issue of sexual assault, the 2024 regulations changed slightly the process by which schools can respond. Under the 2020 regulations, it was very strictly laid out in the regulations regarding an investigation by an unbiased investigator, a decision maker that is different from the investigator that is also unbiased, and very, very laid out. Under the 2024 regulations, it's allowed schools to have a little bit more flexibility. The investigator can also be the decision maker in some circumstances. There's just, in most of the incidences, it's much more flexible for universities to create processes that work for the situation and for them. The one thing that still has to go under the most restrictive process is where a student is either the complainant or the respondent, because of the need to provide maximum due process in those situations. But if it's, employee on employee, we can do, slightly different. And as well as that, there's a difference between sex harassment and sex discrimination under the 2024 regulations. Now, the law has always prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex, and how that's defined in the 2020 regulations in terms of incident response is specific to sex harassment and the way it's defined. But the 2024 regulations go into a much broader definition of sex discrimination. And that's where much of the litigation has arisen from, because it specifically defines a gender identity and transgender people who within the definitions of sex discrimination. So it could potentially be sex discrimination of the 2024 regs to misgender someone repeatedly, to what they call dead name a transgender individual. So things like that aren't covered specifically under the 2020 regulations are now called out in the 2024 regulations. And so those heightened protections for gender identity and transgender individuals have been the impetus for the vast majority of the litigation that has arisen, which is why the Biden administration asked the Supreme Court to limit the injunction to just those provisions and let the rest go through. But not to get too into the legal weeds, but the Bright-Loper case, which overturned Chevron deference, allowed the states to argue that that wasn't good enough, because they were arguing that the entirety of the new regulations were beyond the rulemaking authority of the Department of Education, under the idea that under this new Supreme Court case, Bright-Loper, that courts no longer, federal agencies are no longer entitled to any deference in their administration and making rules by courts, and so courts can completely determine, are now supposed to determine from the start whether any regulations are within the scope of what Congress said in the law. So that was a complicating factor. It was the timing of that case that allowed the state plaintiffs in these Title IX cases to convince the Supreme Court that no part of the rule could be allowed to move forward until all the litigation is done, because no deference should be accorded to the Department of Education in its decision making on this rulemaking.
Thank you.
Great clarity, thank you. Any other questions for Kara? Kara, I echo Margot's comments. Thank you for your due diligence in ensuring safety and well-being of our students is first and foremost, and our staff. That's, as the courts and all of that figure the rest of it out, at the end of the day, that's our biggest job.
Absolutely. Yep.
Thank
We're
you
keeping
so
our
much.
eye on the ball.
Thank you.
Keep us in the loop on progress. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right, item 2B is the academic year 2025 URI Board of Trustees policy list and anticipated review schedule. I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thank you, Courtney. Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'm using a different microphone, so I just wanted to make sure. So this is a brief presentation on Board of Trustees policies that we expect to be brought to the board in the calendar year 25. And thankfully, it's a relatively short list. You have the list in your packet. I can share my screen here just to bring them up, and we'll briefly walk through them. Let's give me one moment. Can everyone see this?
We can.
Okay,
You could make it a little bigger, Dan. That'd be great.
okay, I will. I think some of it gets cut off, but is that better? You can at least see the policies and the dates? Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Thank you.
So we have only one expected new policy at some point this year. It's a policy on tuition. This is currently under development in the provost office. And the idea here is it's an update to the OPC, the Office of the Post-Secondary Commissioner policy that's called Tuition Policy for Public Institutions of Higher Education. And this is part of the process of bringing over some of those OPC specific policies directly to the Board of Trustees. We don't have a date yet on that. That's why it's TBD. And in terms of scheduled review, these are policies that currently are in force, but they have we expect them to come forward. Intellectual property and the conflict of interest in research, their noted due date is at the end of 26. Faculty Senate Executive Committee had asked for a expedited review on those, so they're presently with the Faculty Senate Intellectual Property Committee for their review, so we're waiting for the feedback from that. Consensual relationships and ethics and conflict of interest are also under review in my office at the request of the Faculty Senate Executive Committee. So we expect them to come forward sort of the middle of this year. And then lastly, we expect to bring the policy on board level policies forward probably at the end of the year in an effort to review the administrative policy that's called Policy on Policies that may bring those two together. You'll also see, I'll show this at the beginning of the academic year 26, we don't expect any policies at this time. That may shift as the year goes on, but right now, that's the schedule. And that is it.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate for folks that have been on this committee since the inception, you know that we've been working hard to create a schedule to make sure that we can continue on scheduled reviews. Obviously, things come up as they come up, but you know, we've seen these policies already, most of them with the exception of that one. And so excited to see a calendar and a schedule that we're lining up with. So thank you, Dan. Any questions for Dan? Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Item 2C is the 2024 Board Composition Matrix Survey results. I am going to share my screen. Hopefully it plays nice. Let's see, screen 2, you're all going to see each other and hopefully can see now. There we go. And so wanted to share just a couple highlights of the board composition survey. First and foremost, want to thank the 22 members who have completed the survey. For folks, just a reminder, our board membership hasn't shifted too much in 2024. We did have Richard Humphrey leave the board and David Monterano replace Richard. And so we did have one change, but you can imagine that did not skew our board composition too much. So from a demographics perspective, things pretty much remained very stagnant, but stable. So in-state representation versus out-of-state representation, it's about a 65-35 split. There's about 75% of us are URI alum. And then the gender breakdown, about 62% male, about 38% female, and no one identifying as non-binary. On the age of our trustees, this is a representation of our difference over the course of 4 years from 2020 to 2024. And so you can see some of the difference. We did have continued on, I think our area of biggest growth was 45 to 54 years. Others remain the same or are skewed differently. One thing that's missing in this representation is our student representative. So normally that is at least one of our teammates, our fellow trustees, and so that is not represented in the data. From a race and ethnicity perspective, you see the difference between the last 4 years. We have had a lot of stability. We have seen an increase in our representation on the board for the Black community, but a reduction in our Latino. Again, this is based on the folks who have responded to the survey itself. On expertise, this is 2023 results, but I know it has remained somewhat stable. The top 4 areas of focus for our trustees is executive management, business experience, government relations, government experience, as well as education. Our bottom 4 in areas of expertise is legal and estate, international, technology, and no one identified as having experience in insurance. And then from a skill set perspective, again, stable numbers, but wanted to share our top skill sets on our board is executive leadership, budgeting, and strategic planning. Our bottom, again, is information technology and legal. And so I want to stop there and see if there are any questions that folks have surrounding our board composition.
Courtney, any big gaps that, I mean, I can see where we are, but like big gaps on what relative to like what we think we ought to have represented or?
Yeah, and I'll open up to the governance committee. I mean, I think, you know, from my perspective, I'll share, we need to continue to support or encourage the governor and his team to select trustees of color and strengthen that representation on our board. That's one thing that comes to mind for me, but I want to open it up to other folks on the governance committee.
Courtney,
Joe?
this is Joe Matthews. Two things that strike me, particularly with no representation of Native Americans. And we open every official meeting with an acknowledgement of the land trust.
Yep.
And, you know, they do an outstanding job. I'm just saying. And we should be looking somehow in that area. I think that exactly. The second is we talk about insurance and the lack, not a lot of presence there. And I don't think in terms of insurance because somebody's always trying to sell me that. But risk management is a better way for me to see that. And good heavens, we have large corporations that probably have a bench of knowledgeable people that can help advise internally the board on things that they identify when it comes to things like risk management. I mean, I just learned everything about Title IX in this presentation. And somebody needs to be an advocate for for risk management in general. So those are my 2 observations. Thank you.
No, that's great. And I do, you know, what we normally do is when we're meeting with the governor and their team, kind of sharing some of these areas of where we believe have greatest areas of opportunity for the board. So those are definitely, we'll make sure that those are included. Anyone else want to share any insights or any suggestions as we look at the
Hi,
next?
Courtney, Monica Garn.
Hi, Monica.
I don't know if you can hear me. Hi, everybody. So I would agree with Joe's, did I stop?
You're good.
You're good.
You left.
All right, we'll wait for Monica to come back up. Is there anyone else that would like to share?
I guess I'll just add, and maybe that's where Margot, where you were going with the comments, is just, it'd be nice to see, we're involved in the process, but just to see what are the various fields that we probably should have on the board, right? Like, and what's missing, so we know that where we're sort of high on and low on, but what is missing. So the things that came to mind were, of course, on the legal side, and then also maybe real estate or finance or
IT.
IT. So we've got technology, but what does that mean? So maybe it might be good to look at it that way next, as part of the process. Margaret, you're back. I mean, excuse me. Monica,
Okay, well, I'm gonna try it again. So sorry about that. We have great technology here. So I would just kind of echo the comments around the diversity, just looking at the people of color and what alumni we could potentially identify to bubble up as candidates that could be nominated for the board. And then just diversity of age. If you look at, I know our student representative isn't on there, but I think there's some other, we skew really on the higher side of age and just making sure diversity is also of thought and age and things like that. And so I would just call that out as well.
Great points, Monica. Thank you. Margot?
To that point, one of the corporate boards that I sit on, which is based in the Nordic region, and they have a very different way of thinking about diversity, which is really progressive. And one of the things that they do is they limit any broad category. They define the categories and they limit to a maximum of 60% in any of the broad categories. So rather than having a minimum and like trying to force a minimum, they basically say our goal is to not have more than 60%, like by gender, by race, and age. And so, like, to Monica's point, we violate that in a few areas if we were to think about that. So maybe as we think about when we will talk, when terms are up and we're speaking to the governor about how to put a framework together around this, it's going to force us to try to create some diversity in categories where we are over 60% in some big places.
Yeah, agreed. I love that. And I'd love to take a lead on that from the higher ed's perspective, for sure.
Yep, good.
Any other feedback or thoughts on our composition? All right, so I think what we can do as next steps is we can distill the data further to Margot's point, identify some of the areas. And as we're starting the process, really that will start around January timeframe, where we'll visit with the governor. I know Margot visits and has a conversation with Tony and the governor around kind of where we, who's coming back, who would like to come back, and some thoughts on what we might be missing and would like to add from an expertise and et cetera perspective on the board. So this is a great starter point for that, but we'll distill down further per this conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Margot, that board that you mentioned, do they look at other things like the field of expertise as well? I'm just be curious to see what best practices are out there that we can perhaps use, not just the percentages.
Yeah, they don't look at field of expertise as much. They look at, and this applies not just to the board, but to the employee population. They're really trying to force it through the employee population.
Yeah.
One thing that they do that is, we had a big discussion on recently, is they ask people to identify their how they grew up to the age of 14, what kind of income environment they lived in. Because if you look at a lot of studies will show you that one of the biggest characteristics of your perspective is how you grew up. And so they'll ask, like, up to the age of 14, were your parents, what was their education level? And that single factor has forced a lot of diversity in the employee base. It's really interesting. And it's a global company.
Yeah.
And 55% of Americans answer the question, but 45% deferred not to. Whereas the rest of the world were like, yeah, I'll answer that question. So it was interesting.
Yeah.
But mostly it's what we have here. It's how do you identify as race? How do you identify as gender? And a lot of questions that Courtney reviewed. But that's the one big different one that actually has it has a driver in diversity that is kind of undercover that you don't really see.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Be good to also
Courtney,
compare
one last question.
composition of, no, I was just saying it'd be interesting to compare to the composition of Rhode Islanders too, but
Yeah.
anyway, okay.
Yep.
Monica, go ahead.
Courtney, it's Monica again. Hopefully I don't cut out, but I was just curious, like, do we leverage Lil and her team, well in advance? You talked about this January meeting. Like, is there an expectation on when they would have a deadline to bring potential candidates to us to review well in advance of that January meeting to ensure there is maybe a different diversity makeup of that group?
You want to share your experience? Monica?
Yeah, 100%. And that's in fact where we get a lot of our alumni names from, because we're not going to be as in touch from the URI board standpoint, but Lil's team is. And so that's actually where almost all of our names do surface from, is the work that they're doing, because they're closer to the alumni.
Yeah, it's a great partnership. Okay. All right, thanks so much. So hopping on to 2D, I'm really excited about this. I think one of the things from a governance perspective is constantly looking at ways that we can streamline, we can leverage opportunities to think differently. And so I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa to share an update around board processing streamlining efforts.
Thanks, Courtney. I'm going to try to share the slides. All right, is everybody seeing the slides?
Yep.
Great. Oops. Doesn't really show me how you're seeing it. So are you seeing the full slide there now or not?
Unfortunately, it looks like half of it's cut off now.
Okay.
So where it was originally was probably better.
All right, how about now? Is that good?
Much better, thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, so as Courtney mentioned, this is sort of a key area for this committee. And, at the last board meeting and at other board meetings, there have been comments about ways in which we can make some of the board processes a little bit less formal or feel a little bit less onerous. And there were also comments about sort of burdens on liaisons and preparing for board and committee meetings. And I thought it would be helpful for this committee to look not only at some opportunities, but also to reflect on things that we have been doing. And so that you can potentially report back as a committee to the board about sort of the progress that we've been making, because it's not always visible because it's incremental. And so I wanted to just run through with you some of the things that we have done and some of the ideas for things we might do. So I have been working with Michelle and Lynn over the last couple of years on several things that may not be highly visible, but that we wanted to bring to your attention. So things that we've done so far, obviously the changes to the remote meeting law were huge in terms of things that we've been able to achieve in terms of particularly remote committee meetings, managing quorum issues with, a board of this type. And the second thing is it seems small, but eliminating the agenda approval vote, which is a formality that I determined I didn't think we needed to take. The omnibus voting, we do have a very rigorous process of review at the committee level for any action item that comes to the board, and except in some unusual cases. And so what we're going to do, or what we have done and have been implementing, is omnibus voting on committee recommended actions. So this is not the same as a consent vote, but it's effectively taking all the votes and taking them at once where they've been committee recommended. And we can pull any of those out. The reason it's not the same as a consent vote, which is usually up at the front and you just approve it in the ordinary course, omnibus voting follows the presentations by the committee chairs in which they describe the vote and the recommendation of the committee. So we're still doing all of that work and that diligence to inform the board, but then we're just taking all of the votes at once. So it just saves all that reading into the record, one vote after another after another. And again, we can still pull votes out that any member wants to discuss separately. So I think that's been a really big improvement, and you're going to be seeing that more. In the annotated agendas, Michelle's done some work to make sure that chairs understand that they don't need to read off the agenda item and then also read off the same language as the motion. They can just say, read the motion or say to approve the item in the agenda. So that's another sort of formality that we've been pulling out. One of the things the governance committee has agreed to in the past is eliminating having to have a policy come to them twice before it can go to the board, which is another efficiency. And the joint meeting of the finance and the institutional risk and compliance meeting for the auditor's report. Since that ends up going to both of them, that's another efficiency to have them meet jointly at the end of the year when the auditor's report is given. So those are streamlining efforts that have already happened. Things we can't do is really get rid of some of the OMA language, the Open Meetings Act language. People don't like that, but it does specifically say that needs to be on the record. And so unfortunately, that's a formality we do need to continue to observe. But there are some other things that I think we can do, and I'm working on with Michelle. One is creating shorter, more consistent, more plain language motions. Some of our motions are very well written, and Lynn and Michelle do a really good job having all the formalities covered. But there are things that are informal language that could be shortened. So we could say, instead of, that the governance committee recommend approval to the Board of Trustees to just change to recommend approval of, and take out some of the unnecessary words, and also just a little bit more plain language to shorten it up. So you're going to start seeing that over time. You're going to start seeing slightly shorter, simpler motions to read that don't feel quite so formal, unfortunately, except for that Open Meetings Act language, which has to mirror what's in the statute. And I know Lynn and Michelle have been working with the note takers and really trying to make some of them oh, Lynn is sharing now. Lynn, are you going to go through this?
Put it on. Yes, Alyssa, we can take it from here to get you up to that point. I think we had a technical glitch on your end, but we're going to bring you back up to where you were before.
Okay, great. So mine wasn't showing anymore?
We just had an issue on this end.
Oh.
We're going to bring you right back where you were.
Okay.
Were you in process or are you here?
Yeah, this is where I am now. That's good. So
Okay,
we
great.
talked about,
Thank you.
yeah, we talked about what we've done. We've talked about what's in process. And what I wanted to bring to this committee to discuss was some ideas for other things we might do to reduce some burdens associated with meetings and create some streamlining. So one of those ideas is potentially reducing numbers of committee meetings. Certain committees need to meet before every board meeting. And in particular, I guess the Finance and Facilities Committee is the one that really needs to meet before every board meeting, because they're the one for whom transaction approvals are coming. And each of those things are things that need to be approved at every meeting. But we have already seen some of the committees eliminating a required meeting. So for instance, in the last round of calendar updates, Institutional Risk and Compliance has changed the September meeting to as needed, and Student Life and Athletics has changed their January meeting to as needed. I think they could even potentially change their June meeting to as needed. What I did to sort of come up with these ideas is go through all of this statutorily and board calendar required votes that happen throughout the year, and determine when there's a board vote that happens at one of their 5 meetings that requires a committee to meet before that. And so it's just sort of aligning where we actually need those committees to meet before a board meeting versus where they can be as needed. And so in line with that, another area is the Executive Committee and Compensation Committee only needs to have regular meetings in June and September around the compensation and around performance assessment. If there are labor agreements, collective bargaining agreements that need approval in the interim, we could have scheduled meetings. Academic affairs and research could skip the first meeting of the calendar year. And governance could shift June and September to be only as needed. And this wouldn't be to eliminate any of the things that are currently on their calendars. Those things would just be shifted to other meetings because some of these committees don't have the same time-sensitive nature tasks as, for instance, finance and facilities or institutional risk. So I wanted to get people's thoughts on that as a start. If people were interested in having the committees look at potentially changing some of their meetings to as needed, what it would mean is shifting some of those items on their calendar, going back and reviewing their calendars sort of off cycle. I know they just reviewed their calendars, but going back and looking at their calendars again and changing some of their meetings to as needed. We would still be able to schedule those meetings when they are needed. It would just be that those would not be regularly scheduled meetings, which leads into my second proposal. And so before I do that, I wonder if there are any questions on this.
I love it.
Okay. All right. Can you go on to the next slide, Michelle or Lynn?
The only comment
then-
I would make, Alyssa, and I
Yeah.
appreciate this, and I echo Jay's comment, is that the mission here is to be more efficient,
Yep.
not to do less at committees, because the way our bylaws and our sort of, our philosophy is to do the work at committees, so it's not repeated at the board. But if we can be more efficient with our time and not just get into a rote thing of like meeting all the time, that's a great outcome.
Yeah. And that is the goal. It would be shifting all of the things that they're currently doing, but if they don't have to be specifically in June, for instance, they could move that to April, or they could move that to September. So it's still covering all of those things, but taking the things that are not specifically time sensitive and putting them in another meeting, and really making those full meetings and reducing some of the burden for the liaisons and the secretary and assistant secretary in preparing for quite as many committee meetings before every board meeting. And sort of spreads them out a little bit, so there's not quite so many. In particular, it reduces the number in June. You can see here in that bullet, reducing committee meetings would mean only 3 regular meetings in the January, February, if we went with the proposal that I had made, which is the remote board meeting, which makes sense because that's one that we don't do as much business in. And then the June meeting when we have a retreat. So it's good to have fewer committee meetings, I think, before the January, February, and the June meetings. So what I would like to propose is if we agree on establishing some meetings that are regular committee meetings and others that are only scheduled as needed, that we actually schedule out all of the regular meetings instead of before each board meeting, going out to the committee and the committee chairs and trying to find a time, trying to get the quorum, trying to get a room and having different technology. The idea is that we would have a block of time before every board meeting, and I'm proposing it's the second week before the board meeting, so 2 weeks before the board meeting. During that week, we schedule out in a consistent place with consistent technology what committees are going to meet in that week, and we schedule it out for the year in advance. That way, if there is any quorum problem, Michelle would get notice of that right away because people will know, they already know that next November, their committee meeting is meeting at X time and they know they have to be away in France that day. And so they can let her know right then. She can be determining whether that creates a quorum issue and whether any rescheduling is required or whether she can make that up. And there isn't sort of this last minute hustle and bustle to try to find a time that works for enough people on the committee. Any reaction to that before I move on to the second part of that proposal?
Can't believe it took us 4 years to figure that one out.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some of these are common sense for sure. And then some of these where we needed to get ourselves settled in and start getting us comfortable with cadence, and we learn as we go. And so I really appreciate the fact that we've kind of combined all of these learnings into one place to really move us forward. I'm excited about it.
Great. And so the other thing I wanted to put out there, and different boards have different thoughts on it, but on boards that I've served on, I've generally found that it's helpful if it's a very late in the day meeting. It doesn't necessarily have to be evening. It could be 4 or 4:30. If we could improve our likelihood of quorum if we had a consistent meeting time in that second week before the board. So if it was starting at 4 or 4:30, for instance, to 5:30 or 6, I think people would know in advance that's a block they have to have. It's before dinner. They can either, stay at work and finish that meeting or go home a little early and go to the meeting before dinner. So for remote meetings, I feel like it would be nice to have a particular block like that those meetings are generally scheduled at.
Agreed.
Okay. So can you go on? I also wanted to mention, we do have the executive committee, that the executive committee is able to meet and take action between board meetings. And we have been very careful not to use it in that way because we are very conscious of wanting to make sure the entire board is engaged. But I do think that we very often have to rush things to get them to the board before they otherwise might have been ready, or we're really, really jamming a lot of work onto people in administration to get things done because the board meetings are only 5 times a year, where we could, in some instances, as needed, have the executive committee meet to approve things between board meetings. And that is the way in which executive committees are designed to be used for those instances. And so it's just something to keep in mind if people are comfortable with some transactional things in particular being handled at special executive committee meetings. I think that could take a good deal of pressure off Abby and her staff, for instance, when there's a major transaction that requires a good deal of negotiation and preparation that may be really difficult to get to an early board meeting, or saving it for a later board meeting could result in significant delay to the transaction. So this is just another recommendation. I would, hold in reserve that ability to use the executive committee when we need it.
Great.
Okay. Next slide, please. So just summing it up, I think that the governance committee has an opportunity, Courtney, to report to the full board, sort of, and let the full board know that we have heard these comments. We are responding to them. The board has, the committee and the committee chair have been working with us on efforts that have been undertaken and are underway, and then also bring these recommendations to the full board for consideration, which would then mean at the next round of committee meetings, they take another look again at their calendars.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Alyssa, for all of this and all the hard work that you've done compiling all these insights. I want to turn it over to the committee and get any thoughts that you all have specific to some of these proposed solutions.
I just think it's great. I mean, it's good that you're keeping us in compliance, still moving things along, which is great. So I think that particularly the staff, I'm sure the liaisons appreciate this a ton more. So thank you for taking this on.
Great.
Anyone else have any comments?
Great work.
Thank you.
Great. Good.
Excellent work.
We voting? Because I like to vote.
No vote needed, ma'am. No
All
vote
right.
needed.
Joe
All right.
Matthews here. Joe Matthews here. Alyssa, fabulous presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
You have a nice way about you.
Oh.
But I just think the streamlining of it's a tremendous lift off of the shoulders of administration for all these meetings, and do it when it makes sense. And I think the idea of the executive committee being available to move things along, since that's just more work for Armin and Margot, but I think that's really a great thing to do, and I endorse it. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Joe. The only thing that comes to mind for me is for those as needed meetings. I know that we would have to make sure that we're determining if they're as needed well in advance, probably at least a month or two in advance, so that folks can, from a scheduling perspective, it might get a little difficult, but I know that Michelle and the team can work magic, but I know our calendars are not magical in any way, shape, and form. So the more we can kind of think through that with the chairs of the committees sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Easier said than done, as we all know.
Do people generally, just to get a general idea, do people generally like the idea of doing like a 4 or 4:30 meeting slot in that week, 2 weeks before the board meeting?
I like 4 better than 4:30 only because of kid commitment and all of that, but yeah.
Great.
All right.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Alyssa, so much. Item 2E is the URI Board of Trustees faculty representative appointment. So I'll turn it over to our President Parlange.
Thank you, Courtney. So just to update, first of all, that Melissa Sutherland, who is professor in the College of Nursing, is becoming their Associate Dean of Nursing. And so that's means that she cannot be a faculty representative. I should also remind that Riva Goyal will be continuing as the student representative, and she's in the PharmD program. So I'm happy to announce that Chris Bovey, an archaeology professor, is happy to join the board. She's what's called a zoo archaeologist. She specializes in the analysis of bird bones, and her focus of research has been on the history of human and animal interactions in marine settings. So she tries to understand better past human behavior and generate information about environmental impacts that we see on humans. She is one thing that you may have seen her at different presentations is that she's collaborating with Professor Rod Mather and Catherine de Cesar in the history department and Lorenz Spears in the Tomaquag Museum to explore long-term history use of the URI campus at Kingston. So if you have the opportunity to go on their walk or go to their talks, it's quite good. She's currently the chair of sociology and anthropology. It is her last year serving as chair. And personally, I've gotten to know Chris Bovey because she's worked with us together with the Narragansett tribe on a number of issues. And so she's just been a good colleague and friend to the university, and I'm happy that she can join.
Great. Well, we thank you, Mark. Any questions for Mark? I want to take a moment in recognition of Melissa Sutherland. She's been a great faculty representative. She's been an active faculty representative. I feel like I see Melissa constantly at everything, cheering the university on and also providing great insights in the boardroom as well. So I am very grateful. We'll recognize her in her service as well, and welcome Chris to the URI Board of Trustees.
Yeah, I concur with Courtney's comments, and we're going to have I'm hoping a moment to celebrate Melissa at the board meeting. I'm looking at either Chelsea. Is that right? We're going to have her on the, will she be there so we can thank her publicly?
Yes,
Okay.
she will.
Awesome.
She will.
Thank you.
Very good. Perfect. Thank you so much. As we mentioned earlier, item 2F, we are deferring, and item 3A, which was our only action item for this meeting. And so what I think we are on to action or item number 4, which is adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thanks, Jay. May I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Matt and Monica. And let's see, I'll ask for a voice vote. All in favor, please say yes.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? The ayes have it. The motion to adjourn is approved. The next URI Board of Trustees Governance Committee is scheduled for October 22nd. And I'm sure we're going to see each other even within the next week. Lots going on at the university, lots of exciting things going on at the university. So see you all then. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.